It's one of those topics that most people avoid talking about, the idea that men can have a low sex drive. It challenges a stereotype that's been repeated for generations that men are always ready, always wanting. But what if that's not true? What if there's a deeper story, one that involves biology, psychology, relationships, and even modern culture? In this episode, we'll peel back the layers of a truth that's often hidden in silence, a truth that reveals how complex male desire really is. When we think about men and sex, there's this assumption baked deep into our culture that men are driven by desire almost constantly, that they're biologically programmed to want sex more often, more intensely, and with fewer emotional barriers than women. It's one of those ideas that seems so natural we rarely stop to question it. But if you sit across from enough men in therapy sessions, research interviews, or anonymous surveys, something fascinating and rarely discussed starts to appear. A growing number of men are quietly struggling with low sexual desire, and not because they're broken or defective, but because desire, even for men, is far more psychological, emotional, and contextual than most people think. Let's start with something simple yet profound. Men's sex drive isn't a straight line. It's not a switch that's always turned on. In reality, it's a wave influenced by emotions, stress, self esteem, sleep, and relationship satisfaction. The idea that men are just wired to want sex all the time ignores one key truth about human biology. Hormones may start the story, but the mind writes the script. Testosterone does play a role, yes, but even high levels of testosterone can't override chronic stress or emotional disconnection. A man might have the biological ingredients for desire, but if he's mentally and emotionally drained, those signals get muted. I once spoke to a man in his mid 30s, successful, confident, in a loving relationship, yet he confessed he hadn't felt truly aroused in months. His partner thought he wasn't attracted to her anymore, which only made things worse. But as we talked, it became clear that his issue wasn't physical at all. It was psychological exhaustion. He'd been working long hours, barely sleeping, carrying the weight of expectations, and trying to project an image of control and success. Desire doesn't thrive in that environment, it suffocates. His body wasn't the problem, his mind was overloaded. There's this quiet epidemic of emotional burnout that's dampening male desire across the board. Studies show that stress reduces testosterone levels, but even more importantly, it activates the brain's survival system, the part that says, you don't have time for pleasure, you need to focus on staying safe. When a man is under chronic stress, whether it's financial pressure, relationship conflict, or self doubt, the brain shifts away from pleasure, seeking toward problem solving. Sex becomes secondary, not because it's unwanted, but because it no longer feels accessible. Another factor that's often overlooked is self esteem. A man's sense of desirability is deeply tied to how he perceives his own worth. And here's the paradox: we live in a society that tells men they should always be confident, always in control, always ready. But beneath that expectation lies fear of not measuring up, fear of disappointing a partner, fear of losing sexual performance as they age. That pressure can create a kind of mental noise that drowns out desire. When sex becomes a test instead of an experience, men begin to avoid it. Not because they don't want it, but because they don't want to fail. Let's talk about something that's rarely discussed: the emotional connection between men and their partners. There's this lingering stereotype that men separate sex from emotion, that it's purely physical. But in reality, emotional closeness can amplify male desire in ways that are often underestimated. When a man feels emotionally safe, when he feels accepted, understood, and valued, his desire often blooms. The brain releases oxytocin during intimacy, the same hormone that promotes trust and bonding. So, ironically, the more emotionally connected a man feels, the stronger his biological and psychological drive becomes. In contrast, when there's emotional distance, unresolved tension, criticism, or feeling unseen, desire can wither. Some men withdraw sexually because sex starts to feel like another space where they're not enough. This creates a cycle: the more they withdraw, the more their partner feels rejected, and the more pressure builds. Eventually, both partners start to believe something is wrong with him, when in truth, he's responding to emotional disconnection in a deeply human way. We often forget that desire is fragile. It needs curiosity, novelty, and a sense of safety to thrive. Think of it like a flame. Too much pressure snuffs it out, too little attention, and it fades. In relationships where sex becomes routine or transactional, the spark can dim, not because attraction has vanished, but because the mind has grown bored. The brain's reward system craves novelty, new sensations, new contexts, even new ways of expressing affection. Without that, desire becomes dull, like music played too softly to be heard. One of the most intriguing findings in sexual psychology is how expectation itself shapes desire. When men believe they're supposed to want sex constantly, they stop tuning into their real moment to moment feelings. They start to perform desire rather than feel it. They might initiate sex out of habit or guilt or because they think they should, but not necessarily because they want to, over time that disconnect creates confusion. Desire doesn't disappear, it just becomes harder to recognize. Let's go deeper into the biology for a second. The male brain releases dopamine, the pleasure and motivation neurotransmitter, when anticipating something rewarding. But dopamine is heavily influenced by mood, confidence, and emotional safety. So if a man feels anxious, unworthy, or rejected, his dopamine response diminishes. He may still find his partner attractive, but his body doesn't translate that into desire. What's fascinating is that even small boosts in self esteem or emotional reassurance can restart that process. Something as simple as feeling appreciated, admired, or understood can reignite desire far more effectively than any physical stimulus. Then there's the influence of modern culture, endless comparison, social media, and the constant bombardment of unrealistic sexual standards. Men today are not only competing with each other, they're competing with digital illusions of masculinity and performance. Every image, every video subtly whispers, this is what you should be. That kind of silent comparison eats away at sexual confidence. It's not surprising then that we're seeing more men report sexual anxiety than ever before. When your mind is preoccupied with performance metrics, it's impossible to stay present enough to feel genuine desire. And speaking of presence, mindfulness plays an enormous role in sexual satisfaction. When a man's attention is scattered, thinking about work, finances, or how his body looks, the body's arousal response falters. The brain needs to be in the moment to interpret touch and connection as pleasurable. Men who practice mindfulness based techniques often report not only stronger desire, but deeper intimacy. Because desire isn't about what's happening to the body, it's about what's happening inside the mind. There's another layer that's rarely acknowledged: the role of vulnerability. Culturally, men are taught to suppress emotional expression to appear strong and in control. But the act of sex at its core is vulnerable. You're seen, touched, and exposed in every sense. If a man has spent his life avoiding vulnerability, it makes sense that desire can feel conflicted. The very act that requires openness is also the act he's been conditioned to fear. This tension can lead to withdrawal or detachment, not because he doesn't care, but because his internal wiring associates vulnerability with danger, not pleasure. It's important to remember that low desire isn't inherently bad. It's informative. It's the body's way of signaling that something deeper needs attention. It could be physical health. Yes, low testosterone, poor sleep, certain medications, but it's often psychological. The mind and body speak the same language. When one is overwhelmed, the other quiets down. In that sense, desire becomes a kind of emotional compass pointing toward what's missing: rest, connection, confidence, or safety. I once came across research showing that when men talk openly about their feelings, something many avoid, their reported levels of sexual desire increase over time. Why? Because emotional expression reduces internal tension. It frees up mental energy that was being used to suppress feelings. When a man feels emotionally free, he becomes more open to pleasure. It's not that emotions kill desire, it's that repressed emotions block it. So, what happens when we challenge the myth that men should always be ready for sex? When we let go of that expectation, we create space for real, authentic desire to emerge. Desire that's responsive, alive, and emotionally grounded. Men begin to see sex not as a duty or proof of masculinity, but as a meaningful connection between two people. They start to understand that wanting less at times doesn't make them broken, it makes them human. In couples where this understanding takes root, something remarkable happens. Communication improves, pressure fades, and both partners begin to experience desire as something mutual and flexible. They learn to explore intimacy in ways that feel fresh, not just physically, but emotionally, because ultimately, the key to sustaining desire isn't about frequency, it's about depth. When men feel emotionally secure and seen, desire flows more naturally, not forced, not performed, but felt. We often underestimate how much men crave being desired too. Not just sexually, but emotionally, to feel chosen, admired, wanted. When that sense of being desired disappears, libido often follows. Desire is a two-way mirror. When a man feels wanted, his own wanting intensifies. He feels invisible, it fades. So if we want to understand men's low sex drive, we have to look not just at hormones or health, but at the emotional landscape of their lives, how they're seen, how they're touched, and how safe they feel being themselves. The hidden truth is that men's desire is just as complex, nuanced, and fragile as women's. It's shaped by biology, yes, but sculpted by emotion. Every experience, every rejection, every compliment, every argument, every moment of affection leaves an imprint. Over time, those imprints form patterns, and those patterns become what we call drive. So maybe it's time to stop asking, what's wrong with him? And start asking, what's he feeling? Because beneath every quiet bedroom, every unspoken frustration, there's usually not a lack of attraction. There's a story waiting to be understood. And once we start listening to that story without judgment or expectation, we open the door to something far more powerful than desire alone. We open the door to connection. That's the paradox at the heart of all this. The less pressure men feel to perform, the more space they have to feel, the more they're allowed to be human, vulnerable, emotional, imperfect, the more naturally their desire reawakens. It's not about fixing them, it's about freeing them. And maybe, just maybe, the greatest act of intimacy isn't constant passion. It's the courage to be real with one another, to see desire not as a demand, but as a reflection of who we are and what we need most. Understanding safety and love, when we talk about men and low sex drive, it's usually framed as a problem, something that needs to be fixed. There's this automatic assumption that if a man doesn't want sex as often, something must be wrong. Maybe his hormones are off, maybe he's stressed, maybe he's lost interest in his partner. But what if we've been looking at it all wrong? What if a man's low sex drive isn't a sign of dysfunction at all, but a message, a deeper reflection of what's going on inside him? Because when you strip away all the myths and expectations, desire isn't about constant readiness. It's about meaning, connection, and how safe someone feels being their true self. Men are taught early on that their desire defines their masculinity. From adolescence, the narrative is loud and clear. A real man always wants sex. He's supposed to be the initiator, the pursuer, the one driven by unrelenting instinct. But real life doesn't look like that. In my research and countless conversations with men across ages and backgrounds, I've found that male desire is far more emotional, far more vulnerable, and far more situational than our culture allows it to be. When we stop treating low desire as a malfunction and start seeing it as information, everything changes. Think of desire as a barometer, not just for physical readiness, but for emotional well being. When a man's libido fades, it's rarely random. It often points to something deeper. Maybe he's disconnected from his partner, maybe he's lost confidence in himself, or maybe he's simply overwhelmed by life. The human brain doesn't separate emotional and physical intimacy as neatly as we think it does. In fact, the very same regions that process stress and emotional pain overlap with those that regulate sexual arousal. So when a man's desire drops, it's often his body's way of saying, I need rest, I need connection, I need something more than just physical release. I remember talking to a man in his 40s who described this perfectly. He said, it's not that I don't love my wife. It's that I don't feel like myself anymore. That sentence stuck with me because it revealed something crucial. His low desire wasn't about attraction, it was about identity. He'd been living under constant pressure to be the provider, the problem solver, the man who holds everything together. Somewhere along the way, he stopped feeling seen. His life became about doing, not feeling. And when a person stops feeling, desire naturally quiets down. Because sexual energy doesn't come from performance, it comes from presence. Science supports this in fascinating ways. Neuroimaging studies show that when people experience genuine desire, the brain lights up not just in the areas linked to reward, but in those tied to emotional bonding and self-perception. That means desire is deeply tied to how we see ourselves. If a man feels confident, appreciated, or connected, his desire grows. If he feels unseen, criticized, or emotionally distant, it shrinks. The body responds to the story the mind tells. So when we say a man has low sex drive, what we're often seeing is the visible symptom of an invisible story about self-worth, trust, and safety. Here's where it gets really interesting. Many men who experience low desire describe feeling guilty or even ashamed. They say things like, what's wrong with me? Why don't I want it like I used to? That shame can create a vicious cycle. The more they judge themselves for not wanting sex, the less they actually want it. The brain's pleasure circuits shut down when we associate sex with failure or anxiety. It's almost like desire retreats to protect them from further self-criticism. The irony, of course, is that the more we pressure ourselves to fix desire, the further it slips away. But what if we stopped trying to fix it? What if we started to listen instead? When men begin to explore their low desire with curiosity rather than judgment, they often uncover insights that transform not just their sex life, but their entire emotional landscape. Sometimes they realize they've been performing desire for years, wanting to meet expectations rather than feel genuine connection. Sometimes they discover that what they thought was low libido was actually emotional fatigue. And sometimes they realize that true desire isn't just about wanting sex, it's about wanting closeness. To feel seen, held, desired, not just for what they do, but for who they are. One of the most overlooked truths in sexual psychology is that desire and safety are deeply intertwined. For a man to fully experience sexual desire, he needs to feel emotionally secure, not in a cliche, safe space kind of way, but in a biological, neurological sense. When the brain perceives threat, whether that's stress, conflict, or fear of rejection, it redirects energy away from pleasure. The sympathetic nervous system takes over, flooding the body with cortisol and adrenaline. That's great for survival, terrible for intimacy. But when the brain feels safe, calm, connected, accepted, the parasympathetic system activates. Blood flow increases, dopamine rises, oxytocin builds. That's when desire returns. So low sex drive isn't a broken system, it's a protective one. It's also worth remembering that desire evolves over time. Early in relationships, it's driven by novelty. Dopamine spikes, imagination runs wild, and everything feels electric. But as relationships mature, desire becomes more about emotional rhythm than spontaneous passion. For men, especially, this transition can feel confusing. They might interpret the natural shift as losing it, when in reality, their desire is deepening, moving from performance based to connection based. The problem is, no one teaches men how to nurture that kind of intimacy. They're told to chase excitement, not emotional depth. But the longer I study human sexuality, the clearer it becomes. Emotional intimacy doesn't kill desire, it refines it. There's also the factor of communication, which can't be overstated. Many men find it difficult to talk about low desire because they fear judgment or ridicule. Our culture still treats male sexuality as a linear, unchanging force, always strong, always active. So when that changes, men often retreat into silence, but silence is the enemy of intimacy. When partners can talk openly about desire or the lack of it, it transforms the dynamic. Instead of pressure, there's understanding. Instead of frustration, there's collaboration. It's often in those honest conversations that desire quietly finds its way back. I've seen couples rediscover intimacy, not through elaborate solutions, but through simple connection, sitting close, touching without expectation, learning to be fully present again, because that's the secret we forget. Desire isn't reignited by force, it's rekindled by closeness. When men stop seeing sex as a performance and start experiencing it as communication, as a language of affection, their entire relationship with desire changes. And let's not ignore the physical side. Hormones, sleep, diet, and exercise all influence libido. But again, even these physical factors interact with psychology. For example, low testosterone can reduce desire, but stress also lowers testosterone. Sleep deprivation decreases dopamine sensitivity, but emotional exhaustion can mimic the same effect. It's a feedback loop. The body and mind constantly talk to each other, and desire sits right at the intersection of that conversation. When one side falters, the other compensates. Until it can't, understanding that interplay helps us see that low desire is rarely a single cause issue. It's a complex, beautifully human signal that asks for attention, not correction. There's something profoundly freeing about recognizing that desire doesn't define your worth. I've watched men's entire posture change when they realize this. You can see the relief in their faces, like they've been carrying an invisible weight for years. Because when they stop tying their masculinity to constant arousal, they rediscover space for genuine pleasure. They start to see intimacy not as a test, but as an experience to be shared. And that's where desire becomes authentic again. It's also fascinating to note that as men age, the way they experience desire shifts biologically. Testosterone levels naturally decline, but emotional intelligence and self awareness often increase. Many men report that sex becomes less about urgency and more about depth. They begin to value connection, touch, and affection as integral parts of desire, not separate from it. This isn't decline, it's evolution. The body may slow down, but the emotional core of desire becomes richer. It's like moving from the noise of fireworks to the warmth of a steady flame. One of my favorite studies on this topic found that men who reported the highest levels of sexual satisfaction weren't necessarily the ones with the highest frequency of sex. They were the ones who described feeling most emotionally close to their partners. That single variable, emotional closeness, was a stronger predictor of sexual fulfillment than age, testosterone, or relationship length. That tells us something powerful. Desire doesn't live in the body alone, it lives in the bond. So when we look at men with low sex drive, the question shouldn't be how we fix it, but what's it trying to tell us? Maybe it's saying he's exhausted. Maybe it's saying he doesn't feel desired. Maybe it's asking for deeper connection or a gentler kind of intimacy. When we listen with compassion instead of judgment, desire starts to reawaken, not as an obligation, but as a choice. I've always believed that sexual psychology isn't about solving problems, it's about understanding people. And understanding always begins with curiosity. Every man's relationship with desire is unique, shaped by his history, his body, his emotions, his culture. But beneath all those differences lies a universal truth. Desire thrives where there is freedom. Freedom to feel, to express, to be imperfect. When men are given that freedom, desire doesn't need to be forced. It finds its own rhythm naturally. So maybe low sex drive isn't the villain of the story. Maybe it's the messenger, the part of us that speaks when everything else is too loud. It whispers, slow down. reconnect, remember who you are. And if we listen closely, we realize it's not just about sex at all. It's about self acceptance, emotional honesty, and the courage to be fully human. In the end, the hidden truth about men's low sex drive is that it's not about brokenness. It's about authenticity. When desire quiets, it's not disappearing, it's recalibrating, aligning with what truly matters. And when that alignment happens, when men feel emotionally safe, valued, and free from expectation, desire returns, not as an act of performance, but as a reflection of something real. Because real desire isn't constant and it's never forced. It's a living, breathing expression of connection, the bridge between how we feel and who we love. And that, I think, is what makes it beautiful